Gaetano Casati was an Italian soldier and explorer of Africa. After serving in the Italian army from 1859 to 1879, he sailed to Africa, where he explored the basin of the Beryl Gazelle, as well as the course of the Well River. In 1882, he was taken captive and held prisoner for some time by the native chiefs of Uganda. Subsequently, he lived in the kingdom of Kabariga, where he was condemned to death by the king, but luckily escaped to Lake Albert, where he was rescued in 1888. In this video, Casati's experiences in Equatoria, or the Sudan region, will be discussed, particularly the slave trade that he was an eyewitness to, as well as some of the rather disturbing elements he observed as part of African civilization and culture. Casati observed that both the Dinka Atit and the Dinka Agar not only went on frequent slave raids, but also plundered and enslaved people and entire villages within their own tribe. In 1881, when the governor of the territory was inspecting the different provinces, he liberated 400 slaves in the Role region. These newly liberated slaves then went on to become slavers themselves. Those who didn't become slavers were re-enslaved by their own compatriots. These natives had been practicing slavery on one another antecedent to the arrival of the Arabs, Turks, and other slave-raiding groups involved in the East African or Trans-Saharan slave trade. When Casati was in, or adjacent to the Danagla territory, he came across an Arabic man named Muhammad Abdu, who was well known for being involved in the iniquitous eunuch trade. Within the Trans-Saharan slave trade, there were numerous slavers from the East Coast, Egypt, and beyond, who gave commissions to African kings, chiefs, and slave dealers, to have children and minors crudely, painfully castrated, and then sold into the eunuch trade. Gaetano Casati spoke of the African king of Belima, named Gambari, who was exiled by the governor Romolo Gessi for having been a perpetrator in this illicit trade. Various slave-raiding cannibal tribes, many of who sacrificed and ate their own slaves, like the Mambetu and Sande people, had recently raided and subjected multiple tribes weaker than themselves. The Monfu tribe were of smaller stature than their more powerful neighbors, and were viewed by them as an inferior race. The Bamba Mambetu and other surrounding peoples regularly made slave raids on the Monfu. The adults and physically capable miners were used to work in the fields, while the Monfu infants and children were not uncommonly killed and eaten at organized banquets. Casati learned that the grave of the Italian explorer Giovanni Miani had been dug up and robbed by natives. His corpse was left alone in this instance, due to the grave robbers not having had a taste for white meat. When Casati came to the territory of the Makua people, he observed that a chief named Nasugo had been battling Arab slave dealers for dominance of the region, control of the slave trade, etc. Nasugo's armed attempts at the Arabs having failed, he assumed an air of friendship and obedience to them, and became an accomplice in their slave raids on the cannibal Sande people. After ingratiating himself with these Arabs, Nasugo formed the plan of destroying them by providing them with poisoned meat. In order to further mock and laugh at the Arabs, in addition to killing them, he mixed some human meat into their dish, openly laughing about it with his entourage. For unknown reasons, all her own, a woman under Nasugo's rule went to the Arabs during the night and informed them of Nasugo's plan. With boldness and conviction in the efficacy of his machinations, Nasugo showed up at the Arab camp the next day after the Arabs had presumably taken their meal. With undisguised astonishment and anger, he observed the Arabs in flourishing health. The Arab slavers received Nasugo with their usual courtesy, and he returned to his people confused and perturbed, to say the least. 3 days later, Bashir Saleh, the Arabs' leader, called together a war council that included Nasugo and the chiefs of Bamba and Nyapu. When Nasugo showed up, he was immediately shot and killed. While traveling along, Casati's guide pointed out to him the grave of a distinguished warrior. Casati asked him if everyone who died on the battlefield received the same honor as this man. His guide said no, only people of distinction receive this honor. Then he hesitated. He didn't want to say what Casati already knew, that the great majority of those who fall in battle are eaten by the survivors. It was the traditional custom of the Mambetu to perform human sacrifices at the funerals of their kings. The victims to be sacrificed were selected from the different chiefs of the kingdom. Those of less importance among the Mambetu were honored by the sacrifice of animals. Casati noticed that graves, or tombs, were typically not very elegant in Central Africa. The reason being that the abundance of cannibal tribes in the region would dig up and eat the bodies. So, unless it was the grave of a king or someone of high distinction, not much effort was put into giving the graves any ornamentation, and so on. For days after he and his expedition departed from Tangosi, Casati and company came to a small river called the Tago, from which they could see the vast residence of King Azanga. His gate was ornamented with human skulls, still covered with pieces of flesh and tufts of hair. "Whose heads are those?" Casati asked. "They are the heads of our enemies, the Sande," replied one of Azanga's people. It was further explained that these men had been captives taken in war, who were sacrificed to celebrate the victory of Azanga and his people. "Were any members of your tribe taken captive by the Sande?" asked Casati. "Oh yes," they said. "Why did you not ransom them back through a prisoner exchange?" he asked. They said that they do not make prisoner exchanges unless the prisoner is a person of rank. Common soldier captives were left to be tortured, sacrificed, eaten, in. During his visit here, Casati also learned that anyone who sneezed or coughed in the presence of Azanga was executed. A female slave within Azanga's kingdom, weary from long-continued service, left her master's house and went to stay with some friends. She was arrested and sentenced to death. Instead of a grave, her eternal resting place was in the stomachs of the high-ranking officials of Azanga's court. Casati wrote that he was horror-struck when he saw the roasted leg of this woman. In his conversations with King Azanga, Casati learned that he and his people ate both monkeys and humans. Azanga seemingly relished monkey and human meat equally. While among the Sande people, he was told that the two tasted very similar. Among the Nyapu people, Casati witnessed a native court case where a man was being brought to justice for having stolen a dog. He was sentenced to either become the plaintiff's slave or pay him an indemnity of 2 dogs. Not having or being able to purchase 2 dogs, he was forced into slavery. When Casati arrived at Bodimano, he was able to glean some insight into the native sense of justice through conversation with a prince named Zibo. Zibo was in mourning on this day, his 2 brothers having been killed when they slave-raided a village of the Ababor people. Their band of raiders had been beaten and dispersed, and the 2 brothers had been caught while wandering in the forest and cut up into pieces. Zibo vowed that he would lay the entire Ababua country to waste in retribution. At one point, during his travels and explorations, Casati was offered an entire baboon as a meal. "What am I to do with it?" he said. "It's spoiled by the numerous arrow wounds." "Eat it. The flesh is very nice," his benefactors said. "Thank you, but Europeans don't eat this kind of animal," said Casati. The natives reply, "You are wrong. Vokwo flesh," meaning the baboon, "is as good as man's." This was not the first time natives had voluntarily revealed their cannibal predilections to Casati. Meeting multiple African kings and chiefs, Casati had many long conversations with them, and learned their thoughts and opinions on various important matters of state. In terms of their governing or ruling policy, Casati says, quote, "It is the general opinion among potentates of his rank that the greater number a king kills, the stronger and more powerful he is. Execution by strangulation is here a most barbarous and horrible punishment. The criminal is tied by the neck to the trunk of a tree, and then his legs are pulled till he breathes his last in dreadful sufferings." Unquote. The Sande people would decorate their hair with both animal and human bones. Casati observed among them that dead people's flesh, and that of men killed in war, was a most appreciated dish. If a native among them was convicted and executed by strangulation, they would either eat their corpse afterwards, or simply toss it out for the animals. Sometimes, as a sign of so-called clemency, the king would order that half of the body be interred, and the other half eaten. Kana was the name of the Sande king at the time. They were at war with Azanga and his people. It was cannibal tribe versus cannibal tribe. There was a king, or prince, named Imbanga, who had the skull of an Arab he had killed with a knife made into a cup. He never drank from another cup. The following is a list of tribes Casati came upon who were all at war with one another, despite their common origin. Mabika, Mambu, Mango, Mabali, Mandain, Mapaya, Mambunga, Mele, Mapau, Madigo, Aboy, Ambala, Nemavom, Ekube, Madula, Mambo, Mambo, Magiabi, Apopa, Majigo, and Nyapu. Casati met Governor Charles George Gordon while in Africa, who in their conversation told him about a Sande chief named Wando who he had recently been entertaining. Quoting Casati on what Gordon told him about this chief. "One day he told me that he could not stay any longer with me, because the food at my table did not agree with him. 'How can you be dissatisfied with the food I give you?' I replied. 'Goats, bullocks, and fowls are killed every day in your honor.' 'Oh, my dear friend,' he answered with a deep sigh, 'after abstaining so long from it, I am burning with the desire to eat human flesh.'" End quote. In the following, Casati gives a brief history of slavery among the African natives, and how the trade amongst themselves intersected and somewhat amalgamated with that of the slavers of the Middle East. Quote, "The inclinations of the blacks have solely depended on mistrust, revenge, hatred, and reciprocal destruction, which they consider the noblest virtues, and to satisfy them has been the sole object of their existence. The domination of the strong over the weak led to the primary difference between master and servant, which in course of time, in consequence of the habitual cowardice and superstitious resignation of the latter, degenerated into slavery. The conquered was a slave condemned to work, and an object of exchange as any other merchandise. But the evil did not rest here. Chiefs, who afterwards came into contact with the Arab slave traders, induced by a desire for the possession of objects which satisfied their curiosity, and raised them from their low condition, thoughtless of the ruin they were bringing on themselves, entered into contracts with them. The trade was thus organized. The Negroes became mere beasts of burden, and dragged away from their country, were barbarously sold in the markets. And the Arabs, despising a people who had no religion, and trampling on every right of humanity, hunted the natives as if they had been wild beasts. Egypt and Zanzibar became the great emporiums of human flesh. Europe required treaties against the slave trade, and obtained them, but the evil, deeply rooted and very profitable, only exhibited the appearance of suppression. Mercenary employees, being continually bribed and corrupted, often had a share in the infamous traffic." End quote. The African masses, excluding the ruling elite, were divided into freemen and slaves, slaves being the more numerous. African slavery was perpetuated by birth, meaning that it was hereditary, and it was augmented by wars and slave raids. Native slaves were an inexhaustible source of wealth for their African masters. The African people were so steeped in slavery that within some tribes even the slaves owned slaves. For example, slaves of the Donogla tribe scoured the country, robbing, spreading terror, and enslaving men, women, and children. This is the end of part 1.